Hey guys, welcome back to Zeke's Oboe. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing the tips I use to have an efficient practice session. And these are the things I use. You're welcome to borrow them and even use them in your routine, but they've worked immensely for me, and I'm sure you can benefit from something out of this. So with that being said, let's dive right into the video. So the first thing you want to do is warm up. And there's many different ways you can warm up. I personally love to start with long tones. I hate scales, but I occasionally will work on a scale. But when you're warming up, make sure you're doing everything very slowly. You're basically checking to make sure the instrument, the reed, everything sounds good and is working in proper order. Because when you're about to perform or when you're about to dive into your practice session, you want to make sure that you have no hindrances at the beginning, because that's going to ultimately affect how efficient your time is going to be later on. So the very first thing I like to do is warm up with long tones. And the reason I love long tones is because I love to practice vibrato. It just helps me kind of wake up my body and wake up the instrument, and then it also allows me to see how good the reed is. Because if I'm struggling to play long tones on a reed, then I'm not going to be able to make it through my whole practice session, because it's going to be way harder trying to play for another hour. So that's what I like to do. It shouldn't take more than 5 to 10 minutes. You're just making sure your instrument is ready to play as well as your body is ready to play. So that's what I like to do in a warm-up. Alright, so the next thing you want to do is work on either an etude, a Ferling, or a finger exercise. This could also work as a warm-up because you're mostly warming up your fingers at this point, because the warm-up in the beginning is just to awaken your body and your instrument, so that way it's at its fullest capacity to produce the best tone and sound you're able to do. And again, it doesn't have to be a different etude or Ferling. You could do work on the same one for the week, but the purpose is you're trying to make it better every time you're playing. The purpose of the repetition is so that way you're now trying to make it more musical than it was the day before. This is, like, I would say, part 2 of your warm-up. You're activating your ears as well as your body, if you haven't already done that in the warm-up. So with that being said, let's jump on to the third thing. Now the third thing I like to do is a little bit of sight reading. Now sight reading is something you can really place anywhere. I like to do it at the end, but the only reason I'm saying it's third is just because sometimes people don't like to end with sight reading because it's pretty difficult to do. So whenever I look at sight reading, I always like to choose something that's fun to play. Sometimes I like to make a goal for myself. I'll choose a piece that I don't really want to learn at the moment, but it's something I will want to learn in the future. So I might just sight read it and see how well I can play it. Obviously, I'll see where I start to struggle and which parts that I'll need to later revisit, but I want to see how far I can go without having a major collapse. Now, there's a book that I did in high school, and I'm going to include the link below that you can learn, and I would recommend going through the whole thing, because this ultimately will make you the best sight reader you can possibly be. I would not be anywhere nearly as good as a sight reader if it was not for that book, so I highly recommend it. But again, you don't need to buy that. You can always choose other repertoire, like Bach arias, and just work on that to become a better sight reader. Alright, so the next thing you want to do is now focus on your repertoire. At this point, your mind, your ears, your fingers should all be warmed up and ready to fully engage in your repertoire to the best of your abilities. And that's what the purpose of the warm-up is for. So when you're starting your repertoire, there's 4 different stages, I like to call it. You have the learning stage, the developing stage, the perfecting stage, and then lastly, you're making it musical. So the first stage is where you're first learning the piece. And this is usually your teacher just gave you this piece today, or you've only had it for a week and you don't know how to play all the notes. You're still learning how the piece goes. So in this stage, you want to really focus on practicing with a metronome, because this allows you to see if you're playing rhythms incorrectly, how fast you can go, and what your real skill level is, because the metronome does not lie. So it reveals a lot to you, and it speeds up the learning process. So after you finish the learning process, you can move on to the developing process. And this is usually after you've had like 2 to 3 weeks or even a month on this piece. So you now are quite familiar with this piece. You spend several hours on it and you know how the piece goes. You might even have some parts memorized. And now you're just focusing on more details like articulation, dynamics, and difficult passages. Now the third stage I like to call the perfecting stage. In this stage, you should really have the piece basically nailed down. You know all the notes, you know all the rhythms. The only thing you should be focusing on is perfecting the little parts or passages that you're struggling with to hit consistently. So usually these are the runs, the 16-note runs, the difficult rhythms, things you can't play in tempo all the way through. You have to speed up the tempo or slow it down anywhere from the beginning or the end. This is where the perfecting stage takes place, and you're supposed to even that out. So everything should be consistent and fluid. Honestly, if you make it to this stage, you're in pretty good shape even for a concert or performance. But this is where most people often end, right there. They end where it's like, all right, I learned the piece, I can play every note, and it sounds great. But the next step is what I like to call the making it musical stage. And that's where you really have to push yourself even further than you were before. At this stage, it's a given you can play anything. Once you do have it perfected, you're going to be in this intermediate stage of perfecting it and making it musical. But the musical stage is what sets people from a beginner, intermediate, advanced to a professional. Professionals always make it musical. And that's the biggest difference from advanced players to professional players. Because professional players can do the same thing as advanced players, but now they're making it musical. This last stage is really about trying to find the areas, even those long tones, whole notes, passages where there's not a lot going on. You're trying to figure out, how can I make this passage more musical than it already is? Because playing a whole note is really hard to make musical. But if you can somehow figure that out during this stage, that sets you apart from someone else. So I hope those categories kind of help and you understand what I'm trying to explain to you guys of when you're learning repertoire. I know it could be confusing because this is probably another video in itself, but basically what you're trying to do is whenever you're working on repertoire, you're just trying to develop it further and further than where you were before. You're always continually growing in your repertoire knowledge and skill and your technique, but you want to push yourself to always improve the piece itself and make it more musical. The end goal is to make it more musical. And if you can't do that, then you're either stuck in the earlier stages if you're struggling to make it musical, or you just don't have the technique to get to the last stage. And that's why if you do all these things, eventually everyone should be able to make it musical, no matter what your skill level is. So those are in essence the formula that I use to have an efficient practice, but there are a few more tips that I want to give you guys before I conclude the video. So the first thing I want to impart to you guys is to always play until you are fatigued, or playing until failure. And failure for me is when you can no longer play your instrument anymore. That's when your body's telling you to give up because, hey, my embouchure can't hold the reed anymore, or hey, my mind is just mentally done. Then that is a good time to stop. And that's also going to increase your endurance for the next time you pick up your instrument. The second thing I would advise is creating goals. One thing I like to do is always choose another piece in addition to the repertoire I'm learning as something I would like to learn in the near future. So it's not necessarily I have to learn this by next month, but it's like I want to learn this by the end of next year. And if I can do that while working on this other material, that is a good goal. You want to set goals so that way you can see how far you've come from when you started to where you are now. This also pushes you to work harder and towards them. For instance, if you don't have any goals to push you forward, it's harder to stay motivated to practice, especially in the summer when you're not playing for school or you're not playing anywhere. And this brings me to my next point. Play as much as you can. If you can even get like a group of friends to play once a week or maybe every so often, maybe a couple times a month, this forces you to actually pick up your instrument and practice. Because if you don't have anything set in stone to work towards, chances are you're not going to feel compelled to practice. And that's why you need something to push you to keep practicing. Otherwise, if you're like me, you have a tendency to just not push yourself as hard because you're like, I am not playing anytime soon. I have nothing in the near future. I'm not playing any performances. So why do I need to practice for X amount of hours if there's nothing coming up? If you can just add some things to your calendar or just create times to hang out with friends and play, that will also make you a better musician. Alright guys, so this is the end of our video. I hope you guys are able to mimic this practice outline that I gave you guys and create a schedule around it. There's a lot of useful things, and I'll even include it down below so that way you have an idea of what to work towards and have a more efficient practice session. And again, if you guys have any more questions or love the content that I'm doing and aren't subscribed, make sure you hit that subscribe button today, because I'm going to be posting a lot more now that it's summer. So stay tuned, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your summer. Take care.